In the quiet suburban town of Millbrook, Ohio, 15-year-old Emma Henderson began coming home every night with muddy shoes, offering nothing but evasive answers when her parents asked where she'd been. What started as a minor curiosity soon became a source of growing concern for Sarah and Michael Henderson, as their once open daughter transformed into a secretive stranger before their eyes. But Emma's nightly disappearances were just the beginning of a mystery that would unearth long-buried family secrets and change everything they thought they knew about their past. The first time Sarah Henderson noticed her daughter's muddy shoes, she didn't think much of it. After all, Emma was 15, old enough to walk around the neighborhood with friends, maybe cut through the park on her way home from soccer practice. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when Emma kicked off her white Converse sneakers by the front door, leaving streaks of dark soil across the tile entryway. "Emma, honey, what happened to your shoes?" Sarah called from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air as she stirred the pasta sauce. "Oh, just walked through the park," Emma replied, her voice carrying from upstairs where she'd already disappeared to her room. "Coach made us run some extra drills in the grass." Sarah shrugged and made a mental note to remind Emma to clean her shoes before bringing them inside. She'd been a teenager once too. Tracking mud through the house was practically a rite of passage. But when it happened again the next night and the night after that, Sarah began to pay closer attention. Emma's shoes weren't just dirty, they were caked with a thick clayey mud that Sarah didn't recognize from anywhere in their immediate neighborhood. Millbrook was built on sandy soil, not the heavy clay that seemed to coat Emma's sneakers every evening. "Michael," Sarah said to her husband as they sat on their back deck Friday evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, "have you noticed Emma's been coming home with muddy shoes every night this week?" Michael looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing quarterly reports for his accounting firm. At 42, he maintained the methodical nature that made him successful in his career, but he often missed the smaller details of daily family life that Sarah, a part-time nurse at the local clinic, seemed to notice instinctively. "Muddy shoes?" He adjusted his reading glasses. "Well, she's been doing soccer, hasn't she?" "That's what she says, but I called Coach Martinez yesterday to ask about the extra practices Emma mentioned. He said they haven't had any additional training this week. In fact, he said Emma's been distracted during regular practice, not her usual focused self." Michael closed his laptop, giving Sarah his full attention. "Maybe she's just hanging out with friends somewhere. You know how teenagers are about sharing details." Sarah nodded, but something nagged at her. Emma had always been remarkably open with them. She'd been the type of child who came home from school bursting with stories about her day, who asked permission before making plans, who introduced her friends and brought them over for dinner. This new secretiveness felt completely out of character. That weekend, Sarah decided to investigate further. While Emma was at her Saturday morning soccer game, Sarah examined the muddy shoes more closely. The clay was a reddish-brown color, dense and sticky, unlike anything she'd seen in their suburban neighborhood of well-maintained lawns and paved walking paths. She scraped a small sample into a plastic bag, though she wasn't sure what she planned to do with it. Sunday evening brought more of the same. Emma arrived home at 8:30, just as the family was finishing dinner, her shoes once again caked with the mysterious clay. "Sorry I'm late," Emma said, sliding into her chair at the dining room table. "Lost track of time." "Where were you, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone casual as she served Emma a plate of leftover chicken and vegetables. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Just around, hanging out." "With who?" "Some friends from school." Michael set down his water glass. "Which friends?" "Anyone we know." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly. "Dad, I'm 15. I don't need to give you a detailed itinerary every time I leave the house. We're not asking for an itinerary," Sarah said gently. "We're just curious. You've been coming home late all week and you seem different lately, more distant." "I'm fine, Mom, really." Emma took a large bite of chicken, effectively ending the conversation. But Sarah could see that Emma wasn't fine. Her daughter had always been a good student, but her grades had started slipping. Mrs. Patterson, her English teacher, had called to express concern about Emma's lack of participation in class discussions. Emma, who had always loved to read and write, seemed disengaged from her favorite subjects. The changes weren't just academic. Emma, who used to spend hours talking on the phone with her best friend Jenna, barely seemed to communicate with anyone anymore. She'd grown quieter at dinner, spending most meals pushing food around her plate while staring out the window with a distracted expression. Monday brought a new development. Sarah was folding laundry in the basement when she discovered Emma's jeans from the weekend. The denim was stained with the same reddish clay, but there was something else, small scratches on the fabric, as if Emma had been crawling through underbrush or squeezing through tight spaces. That evening, Sarah positioned herself in the living room with a clear view of the front door. Emma had said she was going to study at the library, but the building closed at 6 p.m. on Mondays. When Emma walked through the door at nearly 9 o'clock, her shoes were predictably muddy, and there were twigs caught in her dark hair. "Emma," Sarah said, standing up from the couch, "we need to talk." Emma froze in the entryway, one muddy shoe half off her foot. "About what?" "About where you've really been going every night. And don't tell me the library because I know it closes at 6. Emma's shoulders sagged. For a moment, Sarah thought her daughter might finally open up, might explain the mysterious absences and secretive behavior. Instead, Emma straightened up and met her mother's gaze with a determination that seemed far too mature for her 15 years. "I can't tell you," Emma said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I just can't." "Emma, honey, you're scaring us. Your father and I are worried sick. If you're in some kind of trouble—" "I'm not in trouble, Mom, I promise. I'm not doing anything dangerous or illegal or stupid. I need you to trust me, please." Sarah wanted to press further, wanted to demand answers, but something in Emma's expression stopped her. Her daughter looked exhausted, as if she were carrying a weight far too heavy for her young shoulders. "Okay," Sarah said finally. "But Emma, if you need help, if anything changes, you'll tell us, won't you?" Emma nodded, though she avoided her mother's eyes. "Yeah, Mom, of course." But as Emma headed upstairs to her room, muddy footprints marking her path, Sarah knew this conversation was far from over. Whatever Emma was hiding, it was consuming her daughter from the inside out. And Sarah Henderson was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant following Emma herself. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work, something she rarely did unless she was genuinely ill. She spent the day researching the area around their neighborhood, trying to identify where Emma might be finding that distinctive reddish clay. Millbrook was primarily built on sandy loam soil, but there were some areas on the outskirts of town where clay deposits were more common, particularly around some of the older, undeveloped properties. She also made some discreet phone calls to the parents of Emma's friends, casually asking if their teenagers had been acting differently lately. Most parents reported nothing unusual, but Jenna's mother mentioned that Jenna had complained about Emma being weird and secretive for the past few weeks. She said Emma cancelled their shopping plans last weekend without explanation, Mrs. Kim told Sarah over the phone. And when Jenna tried to call her, Emma barely talked. She seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. That evening, Sarah shared her findings with Michael. They sat in their bedroom after Emma had gone to sleep, speaking in hushed tones, as if their daughter might somehow overhear them through the closed door. "I think we need to follow her," Sarah said, the words feeling strange as they left her mouth. "I never thought I'd be the type of parent to spy on my child, but Michael, I'm genuinely worried. This isn't normal teenage behavior." Michael rubbed his temples, a gesture Sarah recognized from their early years of marriage when he was wrestling with difficult decisions. "Are you sure we shouldn't try talking to her again first? Maybe approach it differently? I tried again today before dinner. She just shuts down completely. Whatever she's doing, wherever she's going, she's determined to keep it from us. And frankly, that scares me more than anything else." Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. Finally, he sighed. "Okay, we'll follow her tomorrow night. But Sarah, we need to be prepared for whatever we might find. If Emma's going to these lengths to hide something, it might not be what we want to discover." Sarah nodded, though a chill ran down her spine at her husband's words. She thought about the scratches on Emma's jeans, the clay under her fingernails, the exhausted look in her daughter's eyes. What could possibly require such secrecy? What was Emma doing every night that she couldn't share with the parents who loved her? As Sarah lay awake that night, listening to the old house settle around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of discovering something that would change their family forever. The muddy shoes were just the beginning. a trail that would lead them to secrets buried deeper than the clay that Emma tracked through their home each night. Tomorrow they would follow that trail wherever it led, no matter how dark or difficult the destination might prove to be. The next evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Sarah grateful for the warm jacket she'd chosen. She and Michael sat in their car at the end of their street, engine running quietly, watching their house through the rearview mirror. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Emma emerged from the front door, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her white sneakers already laced tight. She looked both ways before heading down the sidewalk in the opposite direction from where her parents waited. "There she goes," Michael whispered, though there was no one around to overhear them. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Two responsible adults in their 40s, following their 15-year-old daughter like private investigators in a bad movie. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the side mirror to keep Emma in sight. "I still can't believe we're doing this." "We don't have a choice," Michael replied, putting the car in drive and slowly following at a distance. "She's not giving us any other option." Emma walked with purpose, her stride confident and direct. She didn't look back, didn't pause to check her phone, didn't exhibit any of the typical teenage behaviors Sarah would have expected. Instead, she moved like someone with a specific destination in mind, someone who had made this journey many times before. They followed Emma through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, past the Kowalski's house with its pristine flower garden, past the corner market where Emma had bought candy as a child, past the elementary school where she'd learned to ride a bike in the parking lot on weekends. But instead of heading toward the town center or the high school where her friends might be, Emma turned onto Maple Street, leading them toward the older section of Millbrook. "Where is she going?" Sarah murmured, keeping her voice low even though Emma was too far away to hear them. The neighborhoods grew less manicured as they drove deeper into the older part of town. Here the houses were smaller and set further apart, with larger lots that hadn't been subdivided for maximum development. Many of the streetlights were older and dimmer, casting longer shadows between pools of yellow light. Emma turned again, this time onto a street Sarah didn't recognize. Oak Ridge Road, according to the green sign they passed. The houses here were even more spread out, some sitting on several acres of land. Several looked abandoned or in various states of disrepair, their windows dark and their driveways cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. "I don't like this," Michael said, slowing the car even more to maintain distance. What business could Emma possibly have in this area? Sarah shared his concern. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where teenagers typically hung out. There were no shops, no restaurants, no obvious gathering places for young people. The few houses that appeared occupied were set far back from the road, their porch lights creating small islands of warmth in an otherwise dark and isolated area. They followed Emma for another 10 minutes, the road becoming narrower and less well-maintained. Sarah's anxiety grew with each turn. This felt wrong, dangerous even. What could possibly draw their daughter to such a remote location night after night? Finally, Emma stopped walking. She stood at the edge of what appeared to be a construction site, though in the darkness it was difficult to make out details. Michael pulled the car over about a quarter-mile back, turning off the headlights but leaving the engine running. "Can you see her?" Sarah asked, straining to peer through the windshield. "Barely. She's climbing over something. A fence, maybe." Sarah grabbed the small flashlight from the glove compartment, but Michael caught her wrist. "We can't use that. She'll see us." They watched in tense silence as Emma's silhouette disappeared beyond what they could now see was a chain-link fence surrounding the construction site. The property appeared to be quite large, stretching back into darkness beyond their line of sight. "We have to get closer," Sarah said. "We need to see what she's doing." Michael hesitated. "Sarah, if she catches us, then we'll deal with that when it happens. Michael, our daughter is alone in an abandoned construction site in the middle of nowhere. We can't just sit here and do nothing." Reluctantly, Michael agreed. They left the car and began walking toward the fence, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The air was crisp and carried the smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves. Their footsteps seemed impossibly loud on the cracked asphalt road. As they drew closer, they could see that the construction site had been abandoned for some time. Heavy machinery sat motionless and covered with tarps, and stacks of building materials were scattered throughout the property. What had once been intended as a housing development now looked like an industrial graveyard. Sarah could hear sounds coming from somewhere within the site, a rhythmic scraping like metal against earth. Her heart pounded as she imagined all the terrible possibilities. Was Emma meeting someone here? Was she involved in something illegal? The isolation of the location made every scenario that crossed Sarah's mind seem more sinister. They found a gap in the fence about 50 yards from where Emma had climbed over. Michael went first, holding the chain link aside for Sarah to squeeze through. The metal was cold and rough under her hands, and she felt a sharp edge catch her jacket as she maneuvered through the opening. Once inside the site, they could see more clearly. The property was larger than it had appeared from the road, with several cleared areas that had been prepared for house foundations. Piles of dirt and gravel created hills and valleys throughout the landscape, and construction equipment cast strange shadows in the moonlight. The scraping sound was coming from the far end of the site, near what looked like it might have been the original farmhouse on the property. The old structure was still standing, though it appeared to be in poor condition with boarded windows and a sagging roof. Sarah and Michael crept closer, using the machinery and dirt piles as cover. As they moved, Sarah became increasingly aware of the mud beneath their feet, the same reddish clay that had been coating Emma's shoes. The ground was soft and treacherous, making their progress slow and difficult. When they were close enough to see more clearly, Sarah gasped and grabbed Michael's arm. About 30 yards away, Emma was kneeling beside what appeared to be a hole in the ground. She had a small camping shovel in her hands and was carefully digging, pausing frequently to examine whatever she was uncovering. "What is she doing?" Michael whispered, his voice tight with tension. Sarah couldn't answer. The sight of her daughter alone in this desolate place, digging in the dark like some kind of grave robber, was more disturbing than anything she had imagined. Emma worked with intense concentration, occasionally reaching into the hole to pull out objects that she examined closely before setting aside. They watched for nearly 20 minutes as Emma continued her mysterious excavation. She seemed to know exactly what she was looking for, working with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Whatever she was digging up, she handled each item with careful deliberation, as if they were precious artifacts rather than objects buried in the mud. Finally, Emma sat back on her heels and surveyed her work. She gathered the items she had collected and placed them carefully in her backpack, then began filling in the hole she had dug. Her movements were methodical and practiced, leaving almost no trace of her activity. Sarah felt Michael tense beside her as Emma began packing up her supplies. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. "If she catches us here." But as they turned to leave, Michael's foot caught on a piece of rebar protruding from the ground. He stumbled, sending a shower of loose gravel cascading down a nearby dirt pile. The sound echoed across the quiet construction site like an avalanche. Emma's head snapped up immediately, her body going rigid with alertness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Is someone there?" Sarah and Michael froze, crouched behind a bulldozer about 40 yards from their daughter. Sarah's heart hammered so loudly, she was certain Emma would hear it. They waited in absolute silence, barely breathing, as Emma slowly stood and scanned the construction site. "I know you're out there," Emma said, her voice stronger now, less frightened and more determined. "I can hear you." For several long minutes, no one moved. Sarah could see Emma standing perfectly still, listening intently for any sound that might give away an intruder's location. Finally, apparently satisfied that she was alone, Emma shouldered her backpack and began making her way back toward the fence. Sarah and Michael remained hidden until they heard the chain-link fence rattle as Emma climbed over it. Only then did they dare to move, making their way carefully back to their own exit point. By the time they reached their car, Emma was already out of sight, presumably heading home by the same route they had followed her. The drive home was tense and silent. Sarah's mind raced with questions and fears, each more troubling than the last. What had Emma been digging up? Why was she doing it alone in such a dangerous and isolated location? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how long had this been going on? When they arrived home, Emma's muddy shoes were already by the front door, and they could hear the shower running upstairs. She had beaten them home by at least 10 minutes, which meant she had been practically running on her return journey. Sarah and Michael sat in their living room, still wearing their jackets, staring at each other in stunned silence. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked finally. Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she recognized from their most stressful moments as parents. I don't know, I honestly don't know. What we saw tonight, it doesn't make any sense. She was digging something up, Michael. Something specific. This wasn't random exploration or teenage rebellion. She knew exactly what she was looking for. But what? And why there, Sarah? That place looked like it's been abandoned for years. What could possibly be buried there that would be important to a 15-year-old girl? Sarah thought about the careful way Emma had handled each object she'd uncovered, the practiced efficiency of her digging, the determination in her voice when she'd called out into the darkness. Whatever Emma was doing, it meant something significant to her. Significant enough to risk her safety night after night, significant enough to lie to her parents and withdraw from her friends. We have to confront her again, Sarah said, but differently this time. We can't let on that we followed her, but we need to make it clear that we know she's not telling us the truth about where she's going. Michael nodded slowly. And if she still won't tell us? Sarah looked toward the stairs, where she could hear Emma moving around in her room, probably changing out of her muddy clothes and preparing for another night of keeping secrets from the people who loved her most. Then we go back, Sarah said quietly. We go back to that construction site during the day and see if we can figure out what she's been digging up. Because Michael, whatever's happening with our daughter, it's consuming her. And I'm not going to sit by and watch her disappear into whatever darkness she's found out there. Upstairs, a door closed softly, and the house settled into the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone is keeping secrets. Sarah and Michael sat in their living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of their home, but feeling further from their daughter than they ever had before. The muddy footprints by the front door seemed to mock them, a daily reminder that Emma was walking a path they couldn't follow, carrying burdens they couldn't share. Tomorrow, Sarah decided, they would return to that abandoned construction site. They would search in daylight for clues about what had drawn their daughter to such a desolate place. Because watching Emma dig alone in the darkness had shown them one thing clearly. Whatever secrets were buried in that reddish clay, they were important enough for Emma to risk everything to uncover them. And Sarah Henderson was determined to discover what those secrets were, even if it meant digging them up herself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson breakfast table as Emma picked at her scrambled eggs, her fork moving the food around her plate without actually eating much of it. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well, and Sarah noticed her daughter's hands had small scratches on them that hadn't been there the day before. Emma, Sarah said carefully, setting down her coffee cup, your father and I need to talk to you about something important. Emma's fork froze mid-motion. About what? Michael cleared his throat, having rehearsed this conversation with Sarah until nearly 2 a.m. Sweetheart, we know you haven't been going to the library or hanging out with friends like you've been telling us. We're worried about you and we need to know the truth. I told you I'm fine, Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. She set down her fork and crossed her arms defensively. Why can't you just trust me? Because you're lying to us, Sarah said gently but firmly. Emma, honey, you're 15 years old, and you're disappearing for hours every night to places you won't tell us about. As your parents, we can't just ignore that. Emma's composure cracked slightly. Her lower lip trembled, and for a moment Sarah thought she might finally break down and tell them everything. Instead, Emma pushed back from the table and stood up abruptly. I can't tell you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I want to, but I can't. You wouldn't understand. Try us, Michael said. Emma, there's nothing you could tell us that would make us love you less. If you're in some kind of trouble. I'm not in trouble. Emma's voice rose and tears began streaming down her cheeks. I'm not doing drugs or drinking or hanging out with bad kids or any of the things you're probably thinking. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, and I'm not trying to hurt myself. I need to do this. I have to do this. Sarah stood and moved toward her daughter, but Emma stepped back, shaking her head. Please, Emma whispered, just give me a little more time. I promise I'll tell you everything soon, but right now I can't. Please don't make me. With that, Emma grabbed her backpack and ran out the front door, leaving for school 20 minutes earlier than usual. Sarah and Michael stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of an unfinished breakfast and the echo of their daughter's anguished plea. She's terrified, Sarah said quietly. Did you see her face? She's not just being secretive, Michael. She's scared. But scared of what? Scared of us finding out or scared of something else entirely? Sarah couldn't answer that question, but Emma's reaction had only strengthened her resolve to discover the truth. After Michael left for work, she called in sick again and drove directly to the construction site they had visited the night before. In daylight, the abandoned development looked even more desolate than it had in darkness. The chain-link fence was rusted and bent in several places, and warning signs posted by the construction company were faded and peeling. Sarah could see why the project had been abandoned. The location was isolated, the access road was in poor condition, and the entire area had an air of neglect that would have made it unappealing to potential home buyers. She parked her car along the road and walked the perimeter of the fence until she found the gap she and Michael had used the night before. In daylight, she could see that someone had been using this entrance regularly. The edges of the chain link were worn smooth, and there was a clear path in the dirt leading from the fence toward the interior of the site. Following the path, Sarah made her way to the area where they had seen Emma digging. The reddish clay was soft under her feet, and she could see multiple disturbed areas where soil had been dug up and refilled. Emma hadn't been working in just one location. There were at least a dozen spots scattered across a roughly circular area about 50 yards in diameter. Sarah knelt beside the most recently disturbed earth and began carefully brushing away the loose soil with her hands. About 6 inches down, her fingers encountered something hard and smooth. She dug more carefully, the way she had seen Emma doing, and eventually uncovered what appeared to be a piece of broken pottery or ceramic. The fragment was about the size of her palm, cream-colored with a delicate blue floral pattern. It looked old, possibly antique, and certainly not something that belonged on a construction site. Sarah continued digging and found several more pieces of pottery, along with what looked like fragments of glass and metal. As she worked, a picture began to emerge. These weren't random objects that had been dumped or lost on the construction site. They were the kinds of items that might be found in the ruins of an old house. Domestic artifacts from decades past. But why would Emma be so interested in collecting these fragments? And why would she risk so much to dig them up in secret? Sarah spent 2 hours methodically searching the area, collecting samples of everything she found. By the time she finished, she had filled a small cardboard box with pottery fragments, pieces of glassware, tarnished metal objects that looked like they might once have been utensils or jewelry, and several items she couldn't immediately identify. On her way home, she stopped at the Millbrook Public Library and asked to speak with Mrs. Chen, the head librarian who also served as the town's unofficial historian. "Sarah Henderson," Mrs. Chen said warmly, looking up from a stack of books she was processing. "How nice to see you. How can I help you today?" Sarah had prepared a cover story, knowing she couldn't reveal the real reason for her visit without betraying Emma's trust. "I'm doing some research for a family genealogy project," she said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "I'm trying to learn more about the history of some of the older properties in town, particularly in the Oak Ridge Road area." Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up with interest. "Oh, that's a fascinating area. There are several properties out there with quite a bit of history. Are you looking for anything specific?" "Well, there's an abandoned construction site out there now. I was wondering what might have been on that land before the development was planned." Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. "Ah, you must be talking about the old Henderson property." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The Henderson property? Yes, it's quite a coincidence, isn't it? The land belonged to a family with the same last name as yours, though I believe they were no relation to your family. The original homestead was built there in the 1920s by Thomas and Margaret Henderson. They farmed the land for several decades before it was eventually sold in the 1970s. Sarah's mind raced. "What happened to the original house?" "It burned down in 1978, I believe. The family had already moved away by then. There was some kind of scandal in the 1940s that forced them to leave Millbrook. The property sat empty for years before a development company bought it in the early 2000s with plans to build condominiums. But then the housing market crashed and the project was abandoned." "What kind of scandal?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Chen leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, this is just what I've heard from the older residents, you understand. Apparently, Thomas Henderson got involved in some kind of political corruption investigation. There were accusations that he had been taking bribes from local officials to keep quiet about safety violations at the mill where he worked. Several families lost their homes when the mill closed suddenly, and there was quite a bit of anger directed at the Hendersons." Sarah felt dizzy. "Do you have any records about this? Newspaper articles, maybe? Oh, certainly. Let me pull up our archived newspaper collection. We have everything from the Millbrook Gazette going back to 1910. Mrs. Chen led Sarah to a computer terminal and helped her access the digital archives. Within minutes, they had found several articles from 1943 and 1944 detailing the investigation into corruption at the Millbrook textile mill. Thomas Henderson's name appeared repeatedly, along with accusations that he had been paid to falsify safety reports that allowed the mill to continue operating with dangerous conditions. The final article, dated September 15, 1944, reported that Thomas Henderson and his family had left Millbrook abruptly after his home was vandalized by angry former mill workers. The article mentioned that Henderson maintained his innocence, but admitted that he had been keeping documents that might prove his claims about being framed by mill management. He said he had evidence, Sarah read aloud from the screen, letters and photographs that would prove the mill owners were the ones taking bribes and that he was just a scapegoat. But he never produced this evidence, Mrs. Chen noted, pointing to a follow-up article from several months later. The investigation concluded that Henderson was guilty and the case was closed. The mill was eventually demolished, and most of the families affected moved away to find work elsewhere. Sarah printed copies of all the relevant articles, her hands shaking slightly as she operated the printer. Mrs. Chen, is it possible that Thomas Henderson might have hidden these documents somewhere on his property before he left town? The librarian considered this. I suppose it's possible. People did hide valuable things during difficult times, especially if they thought they might need to prove their innocence later. But Sarah, why are you asking? This all happened more than 70 years ago. Sarah managed a weak smile. Just curiosity, I suppose. Family history can be fascinating, even when it's not your own family. But as Sarah drove home with the historical records beside her on the passenger seat, she knew it wasn't just curiosity. Emma was digging up artifacts from the old Henderson property, pottery, glassware, and other domestic items that might have belonged to Thomas and Margaret Henderson decades ago. But more importantly, if Mrs. Chen was right about Thomas Henderson hiding evidence to prove his innocence, Emma might be searching for something much more significant than old dishes and household items. That evening, Sarah waited until Emma came home with her predictably muddy shoes before approaching her again. This time, she had a different strategy. "Emma," she said, finding her daughter in the kitchen getting a glass of water, "I went to the library today and learned something interesting. Did you know that there used to be a family named Henderson living on the land where that construction site is now?" Emma nearly dropped her glass. Water sloshed over the rim and onto the counter as she set it down with trembling hands. "You know," Emma said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I know you've been digging there," Sarah admitted. "I don't know why, but I know that's where you've been going every night. Emma, sweetheart, what are you looking for out there?" Emma's facade finally crumbled completely. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs and buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah knelt beside her daughter's chair and gently rubbed her back. "Honey, whatever it is, we can figure it out together, but you have to tell me what's going on." Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Mom, what if our family name isn't just a coincidence? What if we're related to the Hendersons who lived there? What if Thomas Henderson really was innocent, and the evidence he talked about is still buried on that property?" Sarah felt her world shift slightly on its axis. "Emma, what makes you think we might be related to them?" "I've been researching our family tree for a school project," Emma said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I found some records that suggest great-great-grandpa William Henderson might have had a brother named Thomas who lived in Ohio. The dates match up, Mom. And if Thomas really did hide evidence that could clear his name, and if that evidence is still out there, then someone from our family should try to find it." Sarah stared at her daughter, seeing Emma's secretive behavior in an entirely new light. "You've been trying to find this evidence? Alone? At night?" Emma nodded miserably. "I know it sounds crazy, but I found some old maps at the county courthouse that show where the original house used to be. I've been digging around the foundation area, looking for anything that might have been hidden before the fire. I found some household items, but nothing that looks like the kind of documents Thomas Henderson talked about." "Emma, honey, even if we are related to Thomas Henderson, and even if there is evidence buried out there, this isn't something you should be doing by yourself. It's dangerous, and it's not your responsibility to solve a 70-year-old mystery. But what if he really was innocent, Mom? What if he spent the rest of his life being blamed for something he didn't do? What if our family has been carrying that shame for decades, and we could finally prove the truth? Sarah understood now why Emma had been so secretive, so determined, so willing to risk everything for her nightly expeditions. Her daughter hadn't been rebelling or acting out. She had been trying to right a historical wrong, to restore honor to a family name that might be their own. "Okay," Sarah said finally, "but from now on you don't go there alone. If we're going to do this, we do it together, and we do it safely in daylight with proper tools and preparation." Emma looked up with hope in her eyes for the first time in weeks. "You mean it? You'll help me?" Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered what they were getting themselves into. "But first, we need to do more research. We need to find out for certain whether we're related to Thomas Henderson, and we need to understand exactly what kind of evidence he might have hidden. If we're going to dig up the past, Emma, we need to do it right." That night, as Sarah and Michael discussed Emma's revelation, they both felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that their daughter's secretive behavior had an explanation that didn't involve drugs, dangerous friends, or self-destructive choices, but apprehension about the implications of what Emma had discovered. "Do you really think we could be related to this Thomas Henderson?" Michael asked as they prepared for bed. Sarah considered the question. "I don't know, but Emma's research suggests it's possible. And regardless of whether we're related to him or not, if there really is evidence buried out there that could prove an innocent man was wrongly accused, shouldn't someone try to find it?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, this happened over 70 years ago. Everyone involved is probably dead by now. What difference could it possibly make?" Sarah thought about Emma's tear-streaked face, about the determination that had driven her daughter to risk so much in pursuit of truth and justice. "Maybe it won't make a difference to the world, Michael, but it might make a difference to Emma. And if Thomas Henderson really was our ancestor, if he really was innocent, then maybe clearing his name would make a difference to our entire family." As they settled into bed, Sarah couldn't help but think about the pottery fragments and household items Emma had been collecting from the construction site. Somewhere beneath that reddish clay, there might be documents that could rewrite a small piece of Millbrook's history. And tomorrow she and Emma would begin the careful, methodical process of uncovering the truth, whatever that truth might be. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for what Sarah had come to think of as their family archaeological expedition. She packed a cooler with sandwiches and thermoses of hot coffee, while Michael loaded the car with proper digging tools borrowed from their neighbor's garage: shovels, trowels, a metal detector he'd rented from the hardware store, and work gloves for everyone. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching a manila folder thick with photocopied documents, genealogy charts, and hand-drawn maps she'd created during her weeks of solitary research. The dark circles under her eyes were already beginning to fade, and for the first time in months she looked genuinely excited about something. "I still can't believe you guys are actually doing this with me," Emma said as they turned onto Oak Ridge Road. "I was so scared you'd think I was crazy." "Honey, we did think you were crazy," Michael admitted with a gentle smile. "But now that we understand why you were doing it, it doesn't seem crazy anymore. Determined, maybe. Obsessive, definitely. But not crazy." The construction site looked different in the bright morning sunlight. Less ominous, more like what it actually was, an abandoned development project slowly being reclaimed by nature. They parked near the fence and unloaded their equipment, working together to create an organized base camp near the area where Emma had been conducting her solitary excavations. "Show us exactly where you've been digging," Sarah said, spreading a large tarp on the ground to sort their findings. Emma pulled out one of her hand-drawn maps and oriented herself using landmarks she'd memorized during her nighttime visits. "The original house foundation should be right about here," she said, pointing to a slight depression in the ground that was barely visible unless you knew what to look for. "I found most of the household items around the edges of where the foundation would have been." She led them to several spots where she had carefully refilled her excavations, each marked with small stones arranged in patterns only she would recognize. "I tried to be systematic about it," Emma explained. "I've been working my way around the foundation perimeter, digging down about 2 feet in each location." Michael activated the metal detector and began sweeping it over the areas Emma indicated. Within minutes, The device began beeping insistently over a spot about 10 feet from the main foundation area. "There's definitely something metallic down there," he said, setting the detector aside and picking up a shovel. "Emma, based on your research, where would someone hide important documents if they wanted to protect them from fire or weather?" Emma consulted her folder of research notes. "I read that people sometimes buried things in metal containers, coffee tins, ammunition boxes, anything that would keep moisture out, and they usually put them away from the house itself in case of fire, but close enough that they could retrieve them easily." Sarah began digging where the metal detector had indicated, working slowly and carefully to avoid damaging whatever might be buried below. The reddish clay was dense and sticky, making progress slow, but after about 20 minutes, her shovel struck something solid with a distinct metallic clang. "I've got something," she called out, and Emma and Michael immediately gathered around the growing hole. Working together, they carefully excavated around the object until they could see it clearly. It was a rectangular metal box, about the size of a briefcase, with a tight-fitting lid that had protected it from decades of moisture and soil. The metal was corroded but intact, and it was surprisingly heavy when Michael lifted it from the ground. "Should we open it here?" Emma asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "Let's get it cleaned up first," Sarah suggested. "We don't want to damage whatever might be inside." They carried the box to their base camp and used bottled water and rags to carefully clean away the accumulated dirt and corrosion. The box appeared to be a military surplus ammunition container, the kind that would have been readily available in the 1940s. There were faint stenciled letters on the lid, but they were too worn to read clearly. With Emma and Sarah watching anxiously, Michael worked the latches open. They were stiff with age and corrosion, but after several minutes of careful manipulation, the lid finally gave way with a soft pop of escaping air. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and canvas, were dozens of documents. The waterproof packaging had done its job remarkably well. The papers were yellowed with age, but otherwise in excellent condition. There were handwritten letters, official-looking documents with letterheads and seals, and several manila envelopes thick with photographs. Emma's hands shook as she carefully lifted out the first bundle of papers. The top document was a letter written in careful cursive handwriting. "If you are reading this, then something has happened to me and my family, and we have been forced to leave Millbrook without the chance to defend ourselves. The documents in this box contain proof of what really happened at the mill, and evidence that I was not the one taking bribes from the safety inspectors. I pray that someday, someone will find this evidence and use it to clear my name and the name of my family." Thomas Henderson, September 1944. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she read the letter aloud. Here was proof that Thomas Henderson had indeed hidden evidence before fleeing Millbrook, just as Emma had theorized. But more than that, it was a father's desperate attempt to protect his family's honor for future generations. The rest of the documents told a compelling story. There were carbon copies of safety reports that Thomas Henderson had submitted to mill management, documenting dangerous conditions and recommending immediate repairs. There were receipts showing that mill supervisors had received payments from a company that supplied substandard safety equipment. Most damning of all, there were photographs showing mill executives meeting with city officials in expensive restaurants and hotels, along with handwritten notes detailing the dates and amounts of money that changed hands. "This is incredible," Michael said, examining a photograph that clearly showed the mill foreman handing an envelope to a man identified on the back as City Inspector Morrison. Thomas Henderson wasn't taking bribes, he was documenting other people taking bribes. Emma was crying openly now as she read through letter after letter from Thomas Henderson to various authorities, reporting safety violations and pleading for action to protect the mill workers. The letters showed a man desperately trying to do the right thing, becoming increasingly frustrated as his reports were ignored or dismissed. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a carbon copy of a letter dated just days before the mill explosion that had killed 12 workers and injured dozens more. In it, Thomas Henderson warned specifically about the machinery malfunction that would cause the disaster, begging management to shut down the affected equipment for repairs. "He tried to prevent the accident," Emma whispered. "He knew it was going to happen, and he tried to stop it. But they ignored him, and then when it happened, they blamed him for not preventing it." The final documents in the box were perhaps the most heartbreaking. They were letters from Thomas Henderson to his wife, never sent, expressing his anguish over the deaths of his co-workers and his determination to expose the corruption that had caused the tragedy. In one letter he wrote, "Margaret, I cannot live with myself knowing that good men died because of greed and corruption. Even if it costs us everything, I must try to make this right. The families of the dead deserve to know the truth, and the men responsible must be held accountable." But the truth had never come out. Instead, Thomas Henderson had been framed as the scapegoat, forced to flee with his family, while the real criminals continued their corruption unopposed. "We have to do something with this," Emma said firmly, wiping her eyes but speaking with conviction. "We can't just put it back in the ground. People need to know what really happened." Sarah nodded, looking at her daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. Emma's obsessive research and dangerous midnight excavations had been vindicated. She had found exactly what she had been looking for, proof of an innocent man's character and evidence of a historical injustice. "But what can we actually do?" Michael asked practically. "Everyone involved is dead. The mill is gone, the city officials from that time are gone. What difference can it make now?" Emma had clearly thought about this question during her weeks of solitary research. "It matters because the families of the men who died never knew the truth. Some of their descendants still live in Millbrook. And it matters because Thomas Henderson's reputation was destroyed, and if he really is our ancestor, then our family name has been associated with that scandal for 70 years. Sarah thought about the genealogy research Emma had shown her, the family trees and historical records that suggested a connection between their family and the disgraced mill worker. Even if we can't prosecute anyone or change what happened, we can set the historical record straight. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting their find, photographing each document and organizing them chronologically. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic corruption at the mill, with Thomas Henderson as the only honest voice trying to protect the workers from dangerous conditions. As the sun began to set, they carefully repacked the documents and prepared to leave the construction site. Emma took one last look around the area where she had spent so many nights digging alone, searching for truth in the darkness. "I'm proud of you," Sarah told her daughter as they loaded their equipment into the car. "What you did was dangerous and foolish, but it was also brave and honorable. You never gave up on finding the truth." Emma smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Sarah had seen on her daughter's face in months. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Sarah said, "we take this evidence to people who can help us make sure the world knows what really happened. We're going to clear Thomas Henderson's name, and we're going to make sure the families of those mill workers finally learn the truth about why their loved ones died." As they drove home through the gathering dusk, the metal box secured in the trunk of their car, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought their family to this moment. What had started as concern over muddy shoes and secretive behavior had become a quest for historical justice that had brought them closer together than they had been in years. Emma was no longer the distant, troubled teenager who had been sneaking out every night. She was a young woman with purpose and passion, someone willing to fight for truth and justice even when it meant standing alone. And Sarah realized that her daughter's obsession had taught her something important about the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on what you believe is right. The muddy shoes by their front door would soon be just a memory, but the bond forged between parents and daughter in pursuit of truth would last forever. They had unearthed more than just documents and artifacts. They had discovered the strength that comes from standing together for justice, no matter how long delayed. 3 weeks after their discovery at the construction site, the Henderson family found themselves sitting in the crowded conference room of the Millbrook Historical Society, surrounded by local historians, descendants of mill workers, and several members of the press. The metal box sat open on the table before them, its contents carefully preserved in protective sleeves and organized chronologically for presentation. Mrs. Chen, the librarian who had helped Sarah with her initial research, served as the meeting's moderator. She had been instrumental in organizing this gathering after Sarah contacted her about their discovery, recognizing immediately the historical significance of Thomas Henderson's hidden evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Chen began addressing the assembled crowd, "we're here today because of the remarkable detective work of Emma Henderson, a 15-year-old high school student who refused to accept the historical narrative surrounding her family's ancestor. Emma sat between her parents, no longer the secretive, troubled teenager who had been sneaking out night after night. She had spent the past 3 weeks working with local genealogists to confirm what she had suspected all along. Thomas Henderson had indeed been her great-great-great-uncle, making this not just a historical investigation, but a personal quest to restore her family's honor. "The documents we've recovered," Sarah continued, standing to address the group, "paint a very different picture of what happened at the Millbrook textile mill in 1944 than what has been recorded in our town's official history." She began displaying enlarged photographs of the key documents, starting with Thomas Henderson's safety reports and his increasingly desperate letters to mill management about dangerous working conditions. The room grew quiet as she read excerpts from his warnings about the specific machinery malfunction that would eventually cause the explosion. "Thomas Henderson didn't cause the mill disaster," Emma said, her voice stronger and more confident than Sarah had heard it in months. "He tried to prevent it. He documented safety violations, reported corruption, and begged management to fix the problems that would ultimately kill 12 men and injure dozens more." An elderly man in the back of the room raised his hand. "My grandfather was one of the men who died in that explosion," he said quietly. "My family has always wondered why the safety problems weren't caught before the accident happened." Emma pulled out one of the most damning documents, a photograph showing the mill foreman handing money to a city safety inspector. The safety problems were caught. They were reported by Thomas Henderson multiple times, but the people responsible for fixing them were being paid to ignore them. The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Several people were descendants of mill workers, families who had lived for decades, believing that the disaster had been an unavoidable accident or the result of negligence by workers like Thomas Henderson. Mrs. Chen displayed the final piece of evidence, Thomas Henderson's letter explaining why he had hidden the documents. "He knew he was going to be blamed for the corruption he had tried to expose," she said. "So he buried this evidence, hoping that someday his family's name would be cleared." A reporter from the regional newspaper raised her hand. "What happens now? How do we correct 70 years of historical record?" Sarah looked at Emma, who had prepared for this question during their weeks of planning. "We're working with the Historical Society to create a permanent exhibit about the mill disaster and Thomas Henderson's role in trying to prevent it," Emma said. "We're also establishing a scholarship fund in his name for students interested in workplace safety and ethics. But more importantly," Michael added, standing beside his daughter, "we're making sure the families of the mill workers finally know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. They deserve to know that their fathers and grandfathers died, not because of workplace negligence, but because of corporate greed and corruption." The meeting continued for another hour, with families sharing stories about their ancestors and historians discussing how to properly integrate this new information into Millbrook's official records. By the time it ended, there was a palpable sense that something important had been accomplished, not just the correction of historical facts, but the restoration of dignity to both Thomas Henderson and the families of the mill workers who had died. Later that evening, the Henderson family sat in their living room, finally able to relax after weeks of intense preparation for the public presentation. Emma was curled up in her favorite chair, reading a book for pleasure for the first time in months, while Sarah and Michael reviewed the stack of business cards they had collected from people wanting to help with the scholarship fund and historical exhibit. "I still can't believe it's over," Emma said, looking up from her book. "For so long I felt like I was carrying this huge secret, this burden that I couldn't share with anyone, and now the whole town knows the truth." "Are you satisfied with how it turned out?" Sarah asked. "Was it worth all those nights of digging alone in the dark?" Emma considered the question seriously. "It was worth it, but not just because we found the evidence. It was worth it because it brought us together. Before all this started, I felt like I couldn't talk to you guys about the things that really mattered to me. But working together to uncover the truth, it showed me that you really do care about the same things I care about." Michael smiled, remembering his own fears during those early weeks when Emma had been so secretive and distant. "We were so worried you were involved in something dangerous or destructive. We never imagined you were trying to right a historical wrong." "I'm sorry I scared you," Emma said. "I wanted to tell you what I was doing, but I was afraid you'd think it was silly or make me stop before I could find anything." Sarah moved to sit on the arm of Emma's chair. "Honey, what you did wasn't silly. It was remarkable. You saw an injustice and you refused to accept it, even when everyone else had forgotten about it or moved on. That kind of moral courage is rare at any age, let alone at 15. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sarah answered it to find Mrs. Rodriguez, whose grandfather had been one of the mill workers killed in the explosion. She was holding a manila envelope and had tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "but I wanted to give you this. After the meeting today, I went home and looked through my grandmother's things. I found this letter that my grandfather wrote to her just days before the accident." She handed Sarah the envelope, which contained a handwritten letter dated just 3 days before the mill explosion. In it, Mrs. Rodriguez's grandfather wrote about his concerns over workplace safety and mentioned that Thomas Henderson has been trying to get management to fix the dangerous machinery, but they won't listen to him. He wrote that some of the workers were grateful to Thomas Henderson for speaking up about the safety problems. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "My grandfather knew Thomas was trying to protect them. This letter proves that at least some of the workers didn't blame Thomas for what happened." Emma carefully read the letter, her eyes filling with tears. Here was additional evidence that Thomas Henderson had been respected by his fellow workers, that they had recognized his efforts to keep them safe, even if management had ignored his warnings. "Would you be willing to include this letter in the historical exhibit?" Emma asked. "It shows that Thomas Henderson wasn't just trying to clear his own name. He was genuinely trying to protect his co-workers." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "That's exactly why I wanted you to have it. My family has spent 70 years wondering why my grandfather had to die in that accident. Now we know it wasn't because safety regulations were ignored by accident. It was because they were ignored on purpose by people who profited from the corruption." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, the Henderson family sat together processing this additional validation of their discovery. Emma's quest had not only cleared Thomas Henderson's name, but had also provided closure for families who had spent decades without answers about their loved ones' deaths. "So what's next?" Michael asked. "Now that the mystery is solved and the truth is out, what does Emma Henderson, historical detective, plan to do for an encore?" Emma laughed, the sound lighter and more carefree than Sarah had heard in months. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Chen asked if I'd be interested in helping with other historical research projects. Apparently, there are several unsolved mysteries in Millbrook's past that could use some investigation, as long as they don't require midnight excavations at construction sites," Sarah said with a smile. "Deal," Emma replied, "though I have to admit, there's something exciting about uncovering secrets that have been buried for decades. It's like giving a voice to people who thought they would never be heard." Later that night, as Sarah was putting away the last of the research materials they had accumulated over the past month, she came across the plastic bag containing the first sample of clay she had scraped from Emma's shoes weeks earlier. It seemed like such a small thing now, just dried mud from a construction site, but it had been the first clue in a mystery that had ultimately restored honor to their family name and brought justice to the memory of 12 mill workers who had died 70 years ago. She thought about Emma's transformation over the past few weeks. Her daughter had gone from a secretive, troubled teenager to a confident young woman with a clear sense of purpose and justice. The muddy shoes that had caused so much worry had actually been evidence of Emma's determination to uncover truth and fight for what was right. More importantly, the experience had brought their family closer together. Instead of the distant, uncommunicative relationship they had been developing, they now had a shared mission and a deeper understanding of each other's values and priorities. The scholarship fund in Thomas Henderson's name was already generating interest from local businesses and organizations. The Historical Society had committed to creating a permanent exhibit about workplace safety and corporate responsibility, using Thomas Henderson's story as a centerpiece. And most satisfying of all, the families of the mill workers finally had answers about why their loved ones had died. As Sarah turned off the lights and headed upstairs, she reflected on the lessons of the past month. Sometimes the things that worry us most about our children, their secretiveness, their obsessions, their willingness to take risks, are actually signs of their developing character and moral courage. Emma's muddy shoes had been a symbol not of rebellion or dangerous behavior, but of her determination to seek truth and justice, regardless of the personal cost. The construction site where Emma had spent so many nights digging would soon be developed into condominiums, its historical significance now permanently recorded and preserved. But the real construction that had taken place there wasn't the building of new homes. It was the rebuilding of trust between parents and daughter, the restoration of a family's honor, and the construction of a foundation strong enough to support truth and justice even after 70 years of concealment. Emma Henderson's muddy shoes would always remind the family of this remarkable journey, from suspicion and fear to understanding and pride. They had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't found in the places where everyone expects to look, but in the forgotten corners where someone cared enough to keep digging until they found the truth. The mystery of the muddy shoes was solved, but the real story, the story of a family coming together to fight for justice and truth, would continue for generations to come. Thomas Henderson's hidden evidence had finally seen the light of day. His name had been cleared, and his great-great-great-niece had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or words, but with determination, research, and the courage to keep digging until the truth is finally unearthed.